Part 1. The ship they believed could never sink. What if the safest ship in the world became the most famous disaster in history? In 1912, people believed Titanic could not sink. It was called the greatest ship ever built. Big, beautiful, luxurious, powerful. Some people even believed it was unsinkable, and that belief made the story even more terrifying. Because on one freezing night in the Atlantic Ocean, Titanic hit an iceberg, and in less than 3 hours, the impossible happened. The ship was dying. More than 2,200 people were on board. Rich families, workers, immigrants, children, dreamers. Some were laughing only minutes before. Some were drinking tea. Some were sleeping in warm beds. And then suddenly, ice, shock, silence, then fear, then panic, then screams in the dark. More than 1,500 people would never come home. The ocean was black, the water was deadly cold, and help was too far away. But Titanic is not only the story of a ship, it is the story of human pride. A story about what happens when people believe something is too great to fail. At the beginning of the 20th century, the world was changing fast. New machines, new cities, new power. People believed the future had arrived, and Titanic became a symbol of that future. It was built to amaze the world. A floating palace, a moving dream, a giant message that said, "Look what humans can do." The ship was enormous, elegant, modern, and full of confidence. For the rich, it was luxury. For the poor, it was hope. For many immigrants, Titanic was the road to a new life in America. But that dream was already moving toward disaster. Because sometimes, the bigger the dream, the harder it falls. And Titanic would fall harder than anyone imagined. Very soon, passengers would board the ship with excitement. They would wave goodbye. They would smile. They would believe they were safe. They had no idea. They were sailing into one of the darkest nights in history. Part 2. A floating palace full of dreams. In April 1912, Titanic was ready. People came to see it with their own eyes, and many could not believe how huge it was. It looked less like a ship and more like a moving city. On April 10th, Titanic left Southampton, England. Crowds watched from the shore. Families waved goodbye. Passengers smiled from the decks. For many people, this was the beginning of something beautiful. For some, it was luxury. For others, it was a new life. And almost nobody thought it could end in tragedy. The ship carried more than 2,200 people, but not everyone lived the same life on board. Titanic had different worlds inside it. First class was full of elegance. Rich passengers walked through beautiful halls. They ate expensive meals. They slept in warm, comfortable rooms. Everything looked polished, calm, and perfect. It felt safe. It felt powerful. It felt untouchable. But deep below, third-class passengers lived a very different reality. Their rooms were small. Their spaces were simple. But many of them were still full of hope. They were not thinking about luxury. They were thinking about America, a new job, a new home, a second chance. That is what makes Titanic so heartbreaking. On the same ship, some people carried wealth, others carried dreams, and both were moving toward the same dark night. After leaving Southampton, Titanic stopped in France. Then in Ireland, more passengers came aboard. More excitement, more movement, more confidence. Then the ship finally began its journey across the Atlantic Ocean. The engines moved, the smoke rose, the cold sea opened in front of them, and Titanic sailed into history. Everything seemed normal, even beautiful. Music played, people talked, children explored. Rich passengers enjoyed the finest parts of the ship. Others simply enjoyed the feeling of moving toward a better future. Nobody knew that every hour, the ship was getting closer to disaster. And somewhere ahead, far beyond what anyone could see, ice was waiting. Part 3. The Warnings in the Dark. The first days at sea felt peaceful, too peaceful. The ocean looked calm, the ship looked strong, and that made people relax. Passengers laughed. They wrote letters. They walked the decks. They drank coffee. They listened to music. Some talked about business. Some talked about family. Some talked about the future. Titanic was doing exactly what people expected. It was smooth, quiet, elegant, almost magical. This was the kind of trip people would remember forever, but not for the reasons they imagined. As the ship moved deeper into the North Atlantic, the weather became colder. The air changed. The wind felt sharper. The sea looked darker. And on April 14th, warnings began to arrive. Other ships sent messages. They warned Titanic about ice ahead. Icebergs, sea ice, dangerous conditions. The warnings were real, and there was more than one. Some officers understood the risk, but Titanic kept moving. Fast. Too fast. Why? Because speed mattered. Because schedules mattered. Because confidence mattered. And maybe because people believed the ship was too advanced to fail. That belief can be deadly. The night of April 14th was cold and clear. Very clear. And that sounds safe, but it was not. Because the sea was unusually calm. There were no strong waves breaking against the base of an iceberg. That made ice harder to see. The moon was weak. The water was black. And the men watching ahead had a terrible job. They had to find danger in darkness, with only their eyes, no radar, no modern technology, just distance, silence, and night. High above the sea, lookouts searched the horizon, minute after minute. Nothing, only black water, only cold air, only the sound of the ship cutting through the ocean. Then suddenly, something appeared. A shape, a shadow, a giant wall of ice straight ahead. And in that one moment, everything changed. Part 4. Iceberg right ahead. At 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, 1912, the lookouts saw it. An iceberg, straight ahead, huge, dark, silent. One of the men rang the warning bell 3 times. Then he called the bridge. Iceberg right ahead. Everything now depended on seconds. First Officer William Murdoch reacted immediately. He gave the order to turn, hard. At the same time, he tried to stop the engines. The crew moved fast, but Titanic was enormous. Too enormous. A ship that large could not move like a small boat. It needed time, and time was the one thing they did not have. The iceberg was too close, too sudden, too late. Then it happened. A strange sound. Not a giant explosion, not a dramatic crash. Just a long, sharp scraping sound along the side of the ship, like metal being torn open by ice. Many passengers barely noticed it. Some felt a small vibration. Some heard a strange noise. Some simply looked up from their conversations. And then, everything seemed quiet again. That is what made it so dangerous, because the real damage was hidden, below the waterline, where nobody could see it. The iceberg had ripped open the side of the ship, not one giant hole, but a series of openings across several compartments. And that was enough. Titanic was designed to survive flooding in some compartments, But not this many. Water began rushing in, fast, cold, relentless. Engineers quickly understood the truth. The ship was badly wounded, and the water was winning. Down below, crew members watched freezing seawater pour into the lower sections. Boilers, mail rooms, storage spaces, metal corridors. The ship was filling from the inside, and above them, most passengers still had no idea. Some laughed about the strange moment, some went back to bed, some stayed in warm lounges, some asked questions, but many were told not to worry. And for a little while, people believed that. Because how could Titanic be in danger? This was Titanic. The ship people trusted more than the ocean itself. But deep inside the ship, the truth was already clear. This was not a small accident. This was a death sentence. Very soon the captain would know. Very soon impossible words would be spoken. Titanic was going to sink. Part 5. The night turns into panic. Captain Edward Smith was called. He needed answers. Fast. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, studied the damage. He understood what others did not want to believe. Too many compartments were flooding. The front of the ship was already filling with water, and once the water passed from one section to the next, there would be no stopping it. Then came the terrible conclusion. Titanic would sink. Not maybe, not later, not if things got worse. It was already happening. The ship had less than 3 hours. Imagine hearing that. The greatest ship in the world. The ship people believed could not sink. And now, it was dying in the middle of the freezing Atlantic. Captain Smith gave the order. Prepare the lifeboats. And that is when another terrible truth appeared. There were not enough. Not even close. Titanic carried more than 2,200 people, but the lifeboats could hold only around half that number. That meant one thing. Even before the panic began, hundreds of people were already doomed. The crew started waking passengers. Some were confused. Some were annoyed. Some did not understand the danger. Why leave a warm ship for a small open boat in the dark? That sounded crazy, especially because Titanic still looked calm. The lights were still on. The music had not fully stopped. The ship was not yet tilting in a terrifying way. To many people, the danger did not look real. And when danger does not look real, people delay. They hesitate. They make fatal mistakes. Women and children were told to move toward the lifeboats first. Some families obeyed immediately. Others refused to separate. Some husbands smiled and said they would join later. Some mothers held children tightly and tried not to panic. Some passengers still believed the whole thing was only a precaution. But the crew knew better. And below deck, the situation was becoming worse by the minute. Water kept rising. The front of the ship slowly dropped lower. The cold became more intense. The silence became heavier, and fear began to spread. Then class started to matter. First-class passengers often reached the lifeboats sooner. They were closer. They had better access. They got information faster. But many third-class passengers were farther below, in confusing hallways, behind barriers, in unfamiliar parts of the ship. Some did not know where to go. Some could not understand the instructions. Some lost precious minutes. And on Titanic, minutes were life. This is one of the darkest parts of the story, because when disaster came, not everyone had the same chance to survive. Above, lifeboats began to lower into the black ocean. Some left half empty. That is one of the most tragic details of all. There was space, but fear, confusion, and disbelief stole time, and time was everything. Now the truth could no longer hide. The ship was tilting. The cold was sharper. The air felt wrong. People were starting to realize this was real. This was not a drill. This was not a small accident. This was the end. Soon, the lights, the music, the luxury, the confidence, all of it would be swallowed by darkness. And the worst moments of the night had not even begun. Part 6, the final minutes. The night was getting colder. The front of Titanic was sinking deeper into the black ocean. People could feel it now. The deck slowly tilted. Panic spread across the ship. Some passengers cried. Some prayed. Some still could not believe this was real. Lifeboats were leaving one by one, but many people were still on board. Too many. The freezing water kept rising inside the ship. Rooms filled, hallways flooded. The great ship was slowly losing its battle. The band continued to play music. They wanted to keep people calm. Soft music floated through the cold night air. But fear was everywhere now. At 2:18 a.m., the situation became desperate. Titanic tilted sharply. People lost their balance. Some slid across the deck. Some held onto railings. Some jumped into the freezing ocean. Then something terrifying happened. The giant ship began to break apart. The back of Titanic lifted high into the air. For a moment it stood there in the darkness, a massive shadow against the stars. Then the lights went out. Everything became silent, and suddenly, the ship disappeared into the Atlantic Ocean. The night exploded with screams. Hundreds of people were now in the icy water. The temperature was deadly. Most people could survive only minutes. The ocean that looked calm earlier that evening became a place of unimaginable tragedy. Lifeboats floated nearby, but many were afraid to return. Too many desperate people, too much chaos. Slowly, the voices in the water became fewer, and then the ocean grew quiet again. By morning, only a few hundred survivors remained. More than 1,500 people were gone. The world was shocked. How could the greatest ship ever built disappear in just a few hours? The story of Titanic became a warning, a reminder that technology cannot defeat nature, a reminder that confidence can turn into tragedy. And even today, more than 100 years later, people still remember that night. Because Titanic was not just a ship, it was a dream. And on one cold night in 1912, that dream sank into the dark ocean. If you want to learn more powerful stories from history while improving your English, watch the next video on Spin a Yarn English. Your journey through history and English continues there.
Thanks! Please subscribe and like. Spin a new yarn with us every week. See you there!